The wagon wheel cracked clean through on a rock hidden beneath the autumn dust, and Adelaide Fisher knew she had two choices: sit down and wait for death, or start walking toward the smoke rising from somewhere up in those pine-covered mountains. She chose the mountains, grabbing what she could carry from the wagon bed before the sun dropped any lower in the October sky. It was 1873, and she had been traveling alone for 3 weeks since leaving Santa Fe, heading toward California with nothing but the clothes on her back, her dead husband's tools, and a fierce determination to survive. The Wyoming Territory stretched endlessly in every direction, beautiful and merciless, and Adelaide understood that beauty and death often walked hand in hand out here. The smoke came from somewhere higher up, maybe 2 miles through the forest, and she set off with her pack weighing heavy on her shoulders. She was 22 years old, thin from months of sparse eating, her dark hair pulled back in a braid that hung between her shoulder blades. Her husband had died of cholera 6 months ago, and she had sold everything they owned except what she could fit in that wagon. Now the wagon was useless. The horse had broken free and run off during the accident, and Adelaide was alone in the mountains with winter approaching fast. She walked until her legs burned and the smoke smell grew stronger. The pines towered above her, their needles carpeting the forest floor and muffling her footsteps. When she finally saw the cabin, it appeared through the trees like something from a dream, all rough-hewn logs and a stone chimney with actual smoke curling out of it. The structure sat in a small clearing, backed up against the mountainside with a stream running nearby. But what struck her most was how dark it looked despite the daylight. The windows were just black holes in the wood, as though whoever lived there preferred darkness to light. Adelaide approached cautiously, mindful of stories about mountain men who had gone wild from isolation, who shot first and never bothered with questions. But she was desperate, and desperation made people brave in ways that comfort never could. She knocked on the rough wooden door and waited. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she heard movement inside, heavy footsteps, and the door opened just a crack. A single blue eye peered out at her through the gap, and Adelaide found herself looking up at what had to be one of the largest men she had ever seen. "Help you." The voice was deep and rusty, like it had not been used in a long time. Adelaide straightened her spine. "My wagon broke down about 2 miles that way. I saw your smoke. I need help, and I can pay you for your trouble." The eye narrowed. "Pay me how? I have some silver. Not much, but some. Or I can work. I can cook, clean, mend clothes." She hated how desperate she sounded, but there was no point in pride when survival was at stake. The door opened wider, and Adelaide had to tilt her head back to take in the full sight of him. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the entire doorway. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, tied back loosely with a piece of leather cord. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, but she could see the sharp lines of his cheekbones and those startling blue eyes that watched her with an expression somewhere between suspicion and curiosity. He wore a simple homespun shirt that did nothing to hide the powerful build underneath, and buckskin pants that had seen better days. This was a man built for surviving in wild places, all muscle and strength and coiled wariness. "Name's Samuel Ironwood," he said finally. "You can come in for the night. Tomorrow I will help you with your wagon." "Adelaide Fisher," she said. "I appreciate it, Mr. Ironwood." He stepped back to let her pass, and Adelaide walked into the cabin with her heart hammering in her chest. She did not know if she was more afraid of this silent mountain man, or grateful to him for not turning her away. The interior of the cabin was larger than it looked from outside. A single room with a sleeping area in one corner, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace where a small fire burned. But what struck Adelaide immediately was how dark it was. The fire provided the only light, and even that seemed dim and struggling. The windows had heavy shutters closed tight over them, and there were no candles anywhere that she could see. Samuel gestured to one of the chairs. "Sit. You hungry?" "Starving," Adelaide admitted. She had eaten the last of her dried meat that morning, planning to reach the next town by evening. That plan had died with her wagon wheel. Samuel moved to the fireplace where a pot hung over the flames. He ladled something into a wooden bowl and handed it to her along with a spoon. It was some kind of stew, thick with meat and wild onions, and Adelaide ate it without caring what it was made from. It was hot and filling, and that was enough. Samuel sat across from her, watching her eat with that same careful expression. Finally, he spoke. "What's a woman doing traveling alone out here?" Adelaide finished chewing before answering. "Heading to California. My husband died and there was nothing left for me in Santa Fe. Figured I would try my luck out west. California's a long way and winter's coming." "I know." Adelaide met his eyes. "But going back is not an option." Something in her tone must have convinced him not to press further, because he just nodded and stood up. "You can have the bed. I will sleep by the fire." "I could not take your bed, Mr. Ironwood." "Samuel," he corrected. "And yes, you can. I have spent plenty of nights on the floor." Adelaide was too tired to argue. She finished her stew, and Samuel showed her the bed, which was just a simple wooden frame with a mattress stuffed with pine needles and covered with furs. It looked like the most comfortable thing in the world to her exhausted body, but as she settled under the furs, something nagged at her. "Samuel," he was already laying out his bedroll near the fire. "Yeah. Why is it so dark in here? Do you not have any candles?" The silence that followed was long enough that Adelaide thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "Have not had candles in near about 10 years. Fire's enough." Adelaide wanted to ask why, but the exhaustion was pulling her under like a current, and she fell asleep before she could form the words. She woke to the sound of Samuel moving around the cabin in the pre-dawn darkness. He was already dressed and building up the fire when Adelaide sat up, disoriented for a moment before remembering where she was. "Morning," Samuel said without turning around. "There is water in the basin if you want to wash up. We will head to your wagon after you eat." Adelaide washed her face in the cold water and finger-combed her hair before braiding it again. Samuel handed her a plate with cold cornbread and strips of dried venison, which she ate quickly. They did not talk much during breakfast, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. The walk back to the wagon took less time than Adelaide's journey the previous evening, mostly because Samuel seemed to know every path and shortcut through the forest. When they reached the broken wagon, he circled it once, examining the damage with a practiced eye. "Wheel's done for," he said. "But the axle's fine. If you have got another wheel somewhere, I can fix it." Adelaide's heart sank. "I do not have another wheel." Samuel stood up, brushing dirt from his hands. "Then we will have to unload what you want to keep and haul it back to the cabin. You can stay until we figure something out. I cannot impose on you like that." He looked at her with those blue eyes, and Adelaide saw something in them that might have been amusement. "You already are imposing. Might as well make it worthwhile." He gestured to the wagon bed. "What's important?" They spent the next hour sorting through Adelaide's belongings. Most of it was practical supplies: tools, cooking implements, blankets, a few changes of clothes. But there were also some items that Samuel examined with curiosity. "What's all this?" he asked, holding up a cloth-wrapped bundle. Adelaide took it from him and unwrapped it carefully. Inside were several large blocks of rendered fat, yellowish white and waxy to the touch. "Tallow," she said. "I rendered it myself before I left Santa Fe. I was planning to make candles once I got settled somewhere." Samuel's expression shifted, something unreadable crossing his face. "You make candles?" "I used to. My mother taught me. We had a small chandlery back in Ohio before she passed." Adelaide rewrapped the tallow carefully. "I brought the molds and wicks too. Figure I could sell candles wherever I ended up. People always need light." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned back to the wagon and started loading Adelaide's belongings onto the travois he had brought. They made 2 trips back to the cabin, hauling everything Adelaide wanted to keep. By the time they finished, the sun was high overhead and Adelaide was sweating despite the cool autumn air. Back at the cabin, Samuel helped her stack her belongings in one corner. Adelaide looked around the dark interior and made a decision. "I would like to make some candles," she said, "for you, as payment for helping me." Samuel froze in the middle of setting down a crate. "You do not need to do that. I want to. You said you have not had candles in 10 years. Why not?" He straightened up slowly, and Adelaide could see the tension in his shoulders. When he spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "My wife made candles. She died 10 years ago. Have not seen the point in lighting up the dark since then." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with grief that time had not fully healed. Adelaide felt her throat tighten with sympathy. She knew what it was like to lose someone, to have the world go dark in ways that had nothing to do with sunlight. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not mean to bring up painful memories." Samuel shook his head. "It is not painful anymore, just empty." He moved toward the door. "I have got to check my trap lines. We'll be back before dark." He left before Adelaide could respond, and she stood alone in the dim cabin, surrounded by shadows and the ghosts of old grief. She spent the rest of the day organizing her belongings and exploring the cabin more thoroughly. It was clean and well-maintained, but sparse in a way that spoke of a man who had stopped caring about comfort. There were no decorations, no personal touches beyond the necessary tools of survival. The only hint of another life was a small shelf above the bed that held a few carved wooden animals, a bear, an eagle, a wolf. They were beautifully made, detailed enough that Adelaide could see individual feathers and fur. She wondered if Samuel had made them, or if they had belonged to his wife. As the afternoon light began to fade, Adelaide made a decision. She found her candle molds, plain tin cylinders that could make 4 candles at a time, and set them on the table. Then she took one of the blocks of tallow and her small knife and began to cut it into chunks. Making candles was a process Adelaide could do in her sleep. She had been doing it since she was 8 years old, standing on a stool in her mother's chandlery, learning to judge the temperature of the melted fat by sight and smell. She built up the fire until it was hot enough, then set a pot of water to heat with the tallow chunks floating in a smaller pot inside it. While the tallow melted, she prepared the wicks, cutting them to length and threading them through the holes in the bottom of the molds. The cabin filled with the smell of rendering fat, earthy and animal, but not unpleasant. Adelaide worked steadily, pouring the melted tallow into the molds and setting them aside to cool. She had just finished pouring the 4th set when the door opened and Samuel stepped inside. He stopped dead when he saw what she was doing, his eyes going to the molds on the table and then to Adelaide's face. For a moment, she thought he might be angry, but then his expression softened into something that looked almost like wonder. "You actually made them," he said quietly. "I told you I would." Adelaide wiped her hands on a rag. "They need to cool before I can remove them from the molds, but by tomorrow morning you will have candles again." Samuel moved closer, looking down at the molds like they were something precious and fragile. I cannot remember the last time this place was lit up proper. Margaret used to make candles every week, kept the whole cabin glowing like a lantern. After she died, I just let the candles burn down and never made more. Seemed wrong somehow to have light without her here to share it. Adelaide felt her heart ache for this man who had buried himself in darkness, along with his grief. She knew that feeling, the guilt that came with continuing to live after someone you loved was gone. She had felt it herself after her husband died, the strange sense that joy was a betrayal. "Light does not belong to the dead," she said gently. "It belongs to the living. Your wife would not want you sitting in the dark for 10 years, Samuel." He looked at her, really looked at her, and Adelaide saw the moment something shifted in his eyes. "You are probably right. Margaret was always fussing at me to take better care of myself. She would have been furious to see me living like this." "Then let's honor her memory properly," Adelaide said, "with light and warmth and a little bit of beauty in the world." Samuel nodded slowly, and Adelaide thought she saw the faintest hint of a smile beneath his beard. "All right, but on one condition." "What's that?" "You teach me how to make them, so when you leave for California I can keep making them myself." The words "when you leave for California" hit Adelaide harder than she expected. She had only been here one night, but already the idea of leaving felt strange and uncomfortable. She pushed the feeling aside and nodded. "Deal. I will teach you everything I know." They ate dinner together that night, and for the first time, the silence felt warm instead of empty. Samuel was not a big talker, but he answered Adelaide's questions about the area, about his trap lines and the animals he hunted. He had been living in this cabin for 15 years, he told her. He had come west with Margaret after they married, looking for a fresh start away from the crowded cities back east. They had been happy here, built a good life in the wilderness. Then a fever had taken Margaret one winter, and Samuel had stayed on alone, unable to leave the place where he had been happiest. Adelaide told him about her own life, about growing up in Ohio and moving to Santa Fe with her husband, a man named Robert who had dreamed of striking it rich in the silver mines. Robert had been kind but impractical, always chasing the next opportunity and never quite catching it. When he died, Adelaide had been left with nothing but debts and a wagon, and the only sensible thing seemed to be to keep moving west. "What will you do when you get to California?" Samuel asked. Adelaide shrugged. "Find work, I suppose. Maybe open another chandlery if I can save enough money. I am good with my hands and I am not afraid of hard work. California's rough country for a woman alone, so is everywhere else." Adelaide met his eyes. "But I have made it this far, have I not?" Samuel nodded, something that might have been respect in his expression. "That you have." That night, Adelaide lay in the bed again, listening to Samuel's steady breathing from across the room. She thought about what it must have been like for him, spending 10 years in this cabin with only memories for company. She thought about the darkness he had wrapped around himself like a blanket, and she understood it better than he probably realized. Grief was like that sometimes. It was easier to sit in the dark than to face the light and see all the empty spaces where someone used to be. But light was also hope, and Adelaide had not come this far by giving up on hope. The next morning, she woke to find Samuel already up and examining the candles she had made. They had cooled and hardened overnight, smooth columns of pale tallow that smelled faintly of animal fat and rendered promises. "Can I take them out of the molds?" he asked. Adelaide sat up and stretched. "Let me show you how." She joined him at the table and demonstrated how to gently warm the outside of the mold to loosen the candle, then how to push it out from the bottom without breaking it. Samuel watched carefully, then tried it himself with the second mold. His large hands were surprisingly gentle, and the candle slid out perfectly intact. "Good," Adelaide said, pleased. "You are a natural. Samuel held the candle up to the morning light filtering through the cracks in the shutters. It has been a long time since I made anything that was not purely for survival. Feels different. Making something beautiful always does. They spent the morning making another batch of candles, this time with Samuel doing most of the work under Adelaide's instruction. He was a quick learner, carefully judging the temperature of the melting tallow and pouring it with a steady hand. By noon, they had a dozen new candles lined up on the table, more light than the cabin had seen in a decade. "Tonight," Adelaide said, "we light them all." Samuel looked uncertain. "All of them. Every single one. This cabin deserves to glow golden again, Samuel, and so do you." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and darkness crept across the forest, Adelaide and Samuel placed the candles around the cabin. They put them on the table, on the shelf above the bed, on the wide windowsills and the mantel above the fireplace. When everything was ready, Adelaide struck a spark and lit the first candle, then used it to light all the others one by one. The cabin transformed before their eyes. Golden light spilled across the rough wooden walls, chasing shadows into the corners and filling the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The light reflected off the window glass, making the whole cabin glow like a lantern in the wilderness, just as Samuel had described. Adelaide watched his face as he took it in, saw the moment his expression cracked and something raw and painful and beautiful showed through. "It is just like I remembered," he whispered. "Exactly like she used to make it." Adelaide touched his arm gently. "Then she is here with us in the light." "That is how we keep the people we love alive, Samuel. Not by sitting in the dark, but by remembering the beauty they brought into the world and making more of it." Samuel turned to look at her, and in the candlelight his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he said, and Adelaide heard everything he could not say behind those two simple words. They sat together at the table that night, surrounded by golden light, and talked for hours. Samuel told stories about Margaret, about how she had been small and fierce and afraid of absolutely nothing, about how she had shot a bear once when it tried to break into their food stores, and how she could track game better than most men Samuel knew. The stories were full of love and loss, but also laughter, and Adelaide could hear the healing in Samuel's voice as he spoke. Adelaide told him about her mother's chandlery, about the different types of candles they used to make. Tallow for everyday use, beeswax for the wealthy customers, bayberry for the holidays. She told him about her husband's dreams and follies, and about the strange mixture of grief and relief she had felt when he died. It was the first time she had admitted that out loud to anyone, and saying it felt like releasing something she had been holding too tightly. "Is it wrong?" she asked quietly. "To feel relieved that someone is gone," Samuel shook his head. "Love is complicated. Sometimes the hardest thing is loving someone who cannot love themselves enough to build a good life. You did your best by him, Adelaide. That is all anyone can do." His understanding loosened something in Adelaide's chest, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. She blinked them away quickly, but Samuel had already seen. "It is all right to cry," he said gently. "Light and tears can exist together. One does not cancel out the other." So Adelaide cried, letting out months of held-back grief and fear and exhaustion. Samuel sat with her, steady and solid as the mountains themselves, until the tears ran dry and Adelaide felt emptier but also cleaner somehow, like a wound that had finally been drained. The days that followed fell into an easy rhythm. Adelaide would wake to find Samuel already up and preparing breakfast. They would eat together, then Samuel would head out to check his trap lines while Adelaide worked on various tasks around the cabin. She mended his clothes, which were in desperate need of a woman's touch. She organized his supplies and cleaned the corners that had been neglected for too long. And every few days, they made more candles together, building up a stock that would last through the winter. As they worked side by side, Adelaide found herself noticing things about Samuel that she had missed at first. The way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he almost smiled. The gentleness in his hands when he handled fragile things. The way he moved through the forest like he was part of it, reading signs in broken twigs and disturbed earth that were invisible to Adelaide's eyes. He was teaching her wilderness craft without meaning to, pointing out edible plants and showing her how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. And Samuel seemed to be changing too, or perhaps just remembering who he used to be before grief had hollowed him out. He talked more, sharing stories from his youth and asking Adelaide about hers. He opened the shutters during the day, letting light pour into the cabin. He even started carving again, small wooden figures that he worked on in the evenings by candlelight. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after Adelaide's arrival, she was returning to the cabin after washing clothes in the stream when she heard voices. She approached cautiously and found Samuel talking to 2 men on horseback. They wore the rough clothes of trappers, but something about them made Adelaide's instincts prickle with warning. "We are just looking for supplies," one of them was saying. He was lean and sharp-featured with a scar running down his left cheek. "Heard there might be a trading post around here." "No trading post," Samuel said, his voice flat and hard in a way Adelaide had never heard before. "Nearest town is 2 days' ride east, Gila City, Arizona. You can get what you need there." The second man, broader and slower-looking, peered past Samuel at the cabin. "That smoke smells like cooking. You got a woman in there." Adelaide saw Samuel's shoulders tense, saw his hand drift toward the hunting knife on his belt. She made a decision and stepped out of the trees, her arms full of wet laundry. "Samuel, I got those shirts clean like you asked," she called out, keeping her voice steady. She walked toward the cabin without looking directly at the strangers, playing the part of a wife who had chores to focus on. The scarred man's eyes followed her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Well now, that is a pretty sight. You did not mention you had a wife friend." "Did not think it was your business," Samuel said. His posture had shifted into something dangerous, all his mountain man strength coiled and ready. Adelaide reached the cabin and set down the laundry, then positioned herself near the door where she could grab the rifle she knew Samuel kept just inside. She had seen him cleaning it a few days ago. The broad man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "We have been on the trail a long time. Could use some home cooking and maybe some company. What do you say we all share a meal?" "I say you best be moving along," Samuel replied. "Like I told you, Gila City's 2 days east. You can get food and company there." The scarred man's smile hardened. "That is not very neighborly. I am not your neighbor." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Adelaide's hand was on the doorframe, inches from where the rifle waited. She watched the strangers' faces, trying to calculate their intentions. Finally, the scarred man shrugged and gathered his reins. "Suit yourself, but you might want to be more careful, living out here with just a woman for protection. Never know who might come calling." It was a clear threat, thinly veiled as advice. Samuel took a step forward, putting himself between the mounted men and Adelaide. "I will take my chances. Now get off my land." The strangers turned their horses and rode back into the forest, but Adelaide could feel their eyes on her until they disappeared into the trees. When they were finally gone, Samuel stayed frozen in place for another full minute, listening. "They are going to come back," Adelaide said quietly. Samuel nodded. "Likely tonight when they think we are asleep. Men like that always do." He turned to look at her, his face serious. "Can you shoot, my father taught me. I am not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at. Good. Samuel strode into the cabin and emerged with not just the rifle but also a second gun, a pistol that he handed to Adelaide. Keep this on you. We will take turns keeping watch tonight. They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Samuel checked all his weapons and made sure they were loaded and ready. Adelaide gathered their valuables and packed them into saddlebags, just in case they needed to run. They moved the candles away from the windows so the light would not make them easy targets. As darkness fell, Samuel extinguished all the candles except one small stub that he placed in the far corner, barely bright enough to cast shadows. The cabin returned to darkness, but this time it felt protective rather than oppressive, a cloak they could hide behind. "You sleep first," Samuel said. "I will wake you in a few hours." But Adelaide was too keyed up to sleep. She lay in the bed with the pistol under her pillow, listening to every sound from the forest. An owl hooted. Something small rustled through the underbrush. The wind whispered through the pines. Every noise could be danger, and Adelaide's heart hammered in her chest. She must have dozed despite herself, because she woke to Samuel's hand on her shoulder and his voice low in her ear. "They are here, 2 of them, moving through the trees from the north." Adelaide was on her feet instantly, pistol in hand. Samuel positioned her near the back wall, behind the solid protection of a heavy wooden chest. He took up position near the window, his rifle ready. They waited in tense silence. Adelaide could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel sweat trickling down her spine despite the cool night air. Then she heard it, the soft crunch of a footstep on the fallen pine needles outside. The door rattled as someone tested the latch. Samuel had barred it from the inside and it held firm. There was a pause, then a low curse from outside. "We know you are in there," the scarred man's voice called. "Just want to talk, that is all. Maybe work out a trade." Samuel did not respond. Adelaide held her breath. "Come on now, be reasonable. We got gold coin. We'll pay good money for some supplies and the woman's company." Adelaide felt rage burn through her fear. These men thought they could buy her like merchandise, like she was something to be traded and used. Her grip tightened on the pistol. Samuel's voice rang out, hard as iron. "You have got 3 seconds to get off my land before I start shooting. 1. Now that is just unfriendly," the broad man's voice came from near the window. 2. All right, we are going," the scarred man said. "But you are making a mistake, friend. We could have been civilized about this." Samuel reached 3, and when the men did not immediately leave, he fired a shot through the window that shattered the glass and sent both men diving for cover. Adelaide heard cursing and the sound of running feet, then horses crashing through the underbrush, but Samuel did not relax. "Stay down," he warned Adelaide. That was too easy. He was right. The men were circling around, trying to find another way in. Adelaide heard sounds at the back of the cabin, someone trying to climb up to the roof. Samuel moved silently to the back wall and waited. When a dark shape appeared in the small window high up near the roof beam, Samuel fired again. There was a scream and a heavy thud as someone fell. "Jake." The scarred man's voice shouted. "Jake, you hit bad," groaning answered him, and Adelaide heard the sounds of struggle as the broad man was dragged away. Then silence fell again, but this time it felt final. They waited through the rest of the night, taking turns watching, but the men did not return. When dawn finally broke, Samuel went outside to investigate and found blood on the ground beneath the back window, along with a knife one of them had dropped in the scramble. "They will not be back," Samuel said, examining the amount of blood. "That one's hurt bad enough that his partner will be more worried about getting him to a doctor than about causing us trouble." Adelaide felt the tension drain out of her, leaving her shaky and exhausted. Samuel caught her arm as she swayed. "It is all right," he said gently. "You are safe. I will not let anyone hurt you." Adelaide looked up at him, at this strong, fierce man who had defended her without hesitation, and felt something shift in her chest. It was not gratitude, or at least not only gratitude. It was something deeper and more complicated, a recognition that went bone deep. She reached up and touched his bearded cheek, feeling the roughness of it under her palm. "I know," she said softly. "I trust you, Samuel." His eyes darkened, and for a moment Adelaide thought he might kiss her. But instead he stepped back gently and cleared his throat. "We should clean up this glass, and I need to check that they really left." The moment passed, but something had changed between them. Adelaide felt it in the way Samuel's eyes followed her as she moved around the cabin. She felt it in the careful distance he maintained, like he was afraid of getting too close. And she felt it in herself, in the way her heart jumped every time he entered the room. Over the next week, the awareness between them grew into something that filled the cabin like summer heat. Adelaide would catch herself staring at the way Samuel's muscles moved under his shirt when he chopped wood. Samuel would watch Adelaide kneading bread dough, his eyes fixed on her hands with an intensity that had nothing to do with baking. They were careful with each other, almost painfully polite, as though afraid that one wrong word would shatter the delicate thing building between them. But Adelaide was getting tired of being careful. She had spent her whole life being proper and restrained, doing what was expected of her. Out here in the wilderness, with winter creeping closer and the cabin glowing golden with candlelight every evening, she wanted to be brave instead. One night, as they sat at the table making a new batch of candles, Adelaide made her decision. "Samuel, can I ask you something?" He looked up from the tallow he was melting. "Of course." "Why did you tell those men I was your wife?" Samuel's hand stilled. "It seemed like the safest thing." Men like that, they would think twice about bothering a married woman. At least, decent men would. Those two were not decent, but it was worth trying. "And if I really was your wife," Adelaide asked, her heart pounding, "would that be something you would want?" The silence that followed was so complete that Adelaide could hear the candle wax cooling in the molds. Samuel set down the pot he was holding very carefully and looked at her with those blue eyes that seemed to see right through to her soul. "Adelaide, I am 20 years older than you. I have been living alone in these mountains for a decade, barely civilized anymore. You deserve better than a broken-down mountain man with more scars than sense." "That is not an answer," Adelaide said, holding his gaze. "I did not ask if you thought you were good enough for me. I asked if you wanted me." Samuel's jaw worked, and Adelaide saw him struggling with something internal. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. "I want you more than I have wanted anything in 10 years, but that does not make it right." Adelaide stood up and walked around the table until she was standing directly in front of him. "I am 22 years old, Samuel. I am a widow who has traveled hundreds of miles alone, survived attacks from strangers, and built a new life from nothing. I think I am old enough and smart enough to know what I want." "And what do you want?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I want light in the darkness. I want someone who sees me as strong instead of fragile. I want a home, and I want you." She took a breath. "If you want me too, then the rest is just details we can figure out together." Samuel stood slowly, his height suddenly very apparent as he towered over her, but Adelaide was not intimidated. She had seen the gentleness in him, the carefully controlled strength that would never be used to hurt her. "I have not courted a woman in 15 years, he said. "I do not know how to do this anymore." Adelaide smiled. "Well, I have never courted anyone at all. My marriage was arranged by my father, so we are both learning something new." And then Samuel did what Adelaide had been hoping for since that first moment when their eyes met. He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands, looking at her like she was something precious and impossible. Then he bent down and kissed her, gentle and questioning, like he was afraid she might disappear if he held on too tight. Adelaide kissed him back, rising on her toes to close the distance between them. The kiss deepened, becoming less hesitant and more certain, and Adelaide felt heat bloom through her entire body. Samuel's arms came around her, pulling her close, and she could feel the strength of him, all that muscle and power held carefully in check. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I do not want you to regret this." "The only thing I would regret," Adelaide said firmly, "is leaving here without knowing what we could have been together." So they courted in the way of mountain people, with honesty instead of pretense. They took walks through the forest together, and Samuel showed Adelaide his favorite places. A waterfall that froze into crystal sculptures in winter, a meadow where elk came to graze at dawn, a cave filled with ancient paintings left by people long gone. Adelaide shared her dreams with him, her plans for a chandlery and a real home, and Samuel listened like every word mattered. They worked together during the days, falling into a partnership that felt natural and right. Adelaide tanned deer hides with Samuel's help, learning the long process of scraping and treating the leather. Samuel learned to bake bread under Adelaide's instruction, though his loaves came out lopsided and dense. They laughed together over small disasters and celebrated small victories, and every evening they lit the candles and filled the cabin with golden light. And at night, they sat close together and talked for hours, sharing stories and secrets and slowly knitting their lives into a single thread. Samuel told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about learning to trap and hunt from his father. Adelaide told him about her mother's death from consumption, about how she had kept the chandlery running for 2 years before her father insisted she marry. "Did you love your husband?" Samuel asked one night. Adelaide considered the question honestly. "I cared for him. He was kind to me in his way, but love? No, I do not think so. We were companions, not partners. He made decisions and I followed them, and I never felt like we were building something together." She looked at Samuel. "This is different. You ask me what I think. You teach me things and let me teach you. We are equals here." Samuel took her hand, running his thumb across her knuckles. "You are stronger than I ever was, Adelaide. You just had not been given the chance to see it before." The days grew colder as October turned to November, and the first snow began to fall. Samuel spent time reinforcing the cabin's defenses and stocking up on firewood. Adelaide preserved meat and organized their food stores, calculating how much they would need to make it through a mountain winter. "I should start thinking about getting to a town," Adelaide said one evening, though her heart was not in the words. "Once the snow gets too deep, I will be trapped here until spring." Samuel looked up from the beaver pelt he was stretching. "Would that be such a terrible thing?" Adelaide met his eyes. "No, but I do not want to assume I am welcome to stay without you saying so directly." Samuel set aside his work and came to sit beside her. "Adelaide Fisher, I would like you to stay here through the winter, and beyond that, if you are willing." He took both her hands in his. "I know it has not been long, but I have lived enough years to know when something is right. You feel right, like you have always belonged here, like this cabin has been waiting for you to come and light it up again." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes. "I feel the same way, like I have been traveling my whole life and finally found home." "Then stay," Samuel said simply. "Be my partner, my companion. And when spring comes, if you still want to go to California, I will take you there myself, but I am hoping you might want to stay instead." Adelaide laughed through her tears. "I do not think I could leave if I tried. You and this cabin and these mountains have become part of me somehow." They sealed the promise with a kiss, and that night, Adelaide moved her belongings to the big bed and Samuel joined her there. They made love slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies with the same patience they brought to everything else. Afterwards, wrapped in furs and each other's arms, Adelaide felt more at peace than she had in years. The winter that followed was hard but beautiful. The snow piled up until it reached the windows, and the world outside turned into a wonderland of white and silence. Inside the cabin, though, there was warmth and light and laughter. Samuel taught Adelaide to read animal tracks in the snow and how to use snowshoes. Adelaide taught Samuel to make different types of candles, some scented with herbs, some colored with natural dyes, some braided from multiple wicks for extra light. They celebrated Christmas by making a feast of venison and wild turkey, and Samuel carved Adelaide a beautiful wooden figure of a woman holding a candle. Adelaide gave him new shirts she had sewn from traded fabric, fitted properly to his large frame. "These are the first clothes I've had that actually fit in about 10 years, Samuel said, pulling on one of the shirts. "I forgot what that felt like." On New Year's Eve, they lit every candle they had made, filling the cabin with so much golden light that it seemed to push back the winter darkness itself. They danced to music only they could hear, swaying together in the candlelight while snow fell silently outside. "I love you," Adelaide said as they moved together. It was the first time either of them had spoken the words aloud. Samuel pulled back to look at her, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like stars. "I love you too." "I did not think I would ever say those words again, but here you are, making me believe in second chances." "We are both getting second chances," Adelaide said. "That is what makes this so perfect." In February, a warm spell melted enough snow that Samuel was able to make the journey to Gila City. He took a pack full of furs to trade and returned 3 days later with supplies, news, and something else: a preacher. "His name is Reverend Matthews," Samuel explained as Adelaide stared at the kindly-looking older man who had accompanied him. "He travels through the mountains ministering to folks who live too far from town to attend regular services. I asked if he would be willing to perform a marriage ceremony." Adelaide's heart jumped. "You want to marry me, if you will have me," Samuel said. "I know we said we did not need papers to make this real, but I want you to have all the legal protections that come with being my wife. And I want to stand before God and witnesses and promise to love you for the rest of my life." Adelaide threw her arms around his neck. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." They were married 2 days later in the cabin, with the Reverend Matthews officiating and 2 trappers Samuel knew serving as witnesses. Adelaide wore her best dress, which she had carefully preserved through all her travels, and Samuel wore one of the new shirts she had made him. They lit every candle in the cabin until the whole place glowed like a church filled with holy light. The ceremony was simple but profound. When Samuel slipped a ring onto Adelaide's finger, a simple band of carved wood since there was no gold to be had, Adelaide felt the weight of it like a promise made in flesh and time. "I, Samuel Ironwood, take you, Adelaide Fisher, to be my lawfully wedded wife," Samuel said, his voice steady and sure. "I promise to protect you, to honor you, to stand beside you through whatever comes. I promise to keep our home filled with light and warmth, and to love you until my last breath." Adelaide's voice shook, but did not break as she made her own vows. "I, Adelaide Fisher, take you, Samuel Ironwood, to be my lawfully wedded husband. I promise to be your partner in all things, to bring light into the darkness, to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and our future. I promise to love you fiercely and completely for all the days of my life." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed Adelaide with a tenderness that made her heart ache. The witnesses cheered, and Adelaide laughed against Samuel's lips, dizzy with joy. They celebrated with food and drink, and the reverend and witnesses stayed for 2 days before heading back to civilization. When they finally left, Samuel and Adelaide were alone again, but this time with the legal bonds of marriage tying them together as firmly as the emotional ones already had. Spring came slowly to the mountains, creeping in through melting snow and early flowers. Adelaide and Samuel spent the warming days making plans for the future. They would expand the cabin, adding a separate room that could serve as a workshop for Adelaide's candle making. Samuel would increase his trapping routes to bring in more money. Eventually, they might even make the journey to Gila City and set up a proper chandlery there, though Adelaide found she was in no hurry to leave the mountains. "I used to think I needed California to make a fresh start," she told Samuel one morning as they worked in the garden plot they were preparing. "But I found everything I needed right here." Samuel looked up from the soil he was turning. "California would have been lucky to have you. But I am selfish enough to be glad you stayed." In late April, Adelaide realized her monthly bleeding had not come, and by May she was certain. She was carrying Samuel's child. The news filled them both with a mixture of joy and fear. Samuel worried about Adelaide's safety, about the risks of childbirth so far from doctors and midwives. But Adelaide was confident and calm. "Women have been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time," she reminded him. "And the Reverend said there is a midwife in Gila City, a woman named Mrs. Patterson who has delivered hundreds of healthy babies. When my time gets close, we will go stay in town if that makes you feel better." Samuel held her close, one hand resting protectively over her still flat belly. "I just want you both to be safe." "We will be," Adelaide promised. "You will not lose me, Samuel. I am stronger than I look, and I have too much to live for to go anywhere." They spent the summer preparing for the baby's arrival. Samuel carved a beautiful wooden cradle with incredible detail, every surface smooth and perfect. Adelaide sewed tiny clothes and blankets, marveling at how small they seemed. They reinforced the cabin's structure and stocked up on supplies, preparing for the possibility that they might be snowed in with a newborn. In August, they made the journey to Gila City to meet with Mrs. Patterson and arrange for her to attend the birth. The town was rough and rowdy, a mining settlement that had sprung up almost overnight, but Mrs. Patterson herself was a calm, competent woman in her 50s who had birthed 3 children of her own and countless others. "You are healthy and strong," she told Adelaide after examining her. "I see no reason why you should not have an easy delivery. But I agree with your husband that it would be wise for you to come stay in town when your time is near. These mountain winters can be unpredictable, and I have seen too many women lose babies because they could not get help when something went wrong. So they made plans. Adelaide would come to town in early December, about 2 weeks before the baby was expected. Samuel would stay with her, and they would rent a room at the boarding house until after the birth and Adelaide was strong enough to travel. Back at the cabin, they fell into the rhythms of summer and early fall. Adelaide's belly grew round and full, and Samuel treated her like she was made of glass, constantly worried that she was doing too much. Adelaide found his protectiveness both endearing and occasionally frustrating. "I am pregnant, not dying," she would remind him when he tried to stop her from carrying water or tending the garden. "Women work right up until their labor begins. I am fine." But she appreciated his care, the way he made sure she always had enough to eat, the way he would rub her aching feet in the evenings. And when the baby moved for the first time, a flutter like butterfly wings inside her, She took Samuel's hand and placed it on her belly so he could feel it too. "That is our child," she said, watching wonder spread across his face. "Our second chance made real." Samuel's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I would have this again. A wife, a child, a real family. After Margaret died, I was certain that part of my life was over forever." "Nothing is ever truly over," Adelaide said gently. "Not as long as we keep living and hoping and trying. Margaret would want you to be happy, Samuel. She would want you to have this." He nodded, unable to speak, and Adelaide held him while he cried tears that were equal parts grief and joy. In November, as planned, they made the journey to Gila City. The trip took 3 days instead of the usual 2 because Samuel insisted on frequent stops so Adelaide could rest. When they finally arrived, Mrs. Patterson welcomed them warmly and showed them to a clean room at the boarding house. "Your timing is perfect," she said. "There is another woman here expecting around the same time, so I will be close by. You just settle in and try to relax." The waiting was hard. Adelaide felt huge and ungainly, her ankles swollen and her back constantly aching. She made candles to pass the time, teaching several women in town her craft and earning a bit of money selling her wares. Samuel found work helping at the livery stable, keeping himself busy so he would not pace holes in the floor. On December 15th, 2 weeks after they had arrived in town, Adelaide woke in the middle of the night to a sharp pain in her belly. She knew immediately what it meant. "Samuel," she said, shaking him awake, "it is time." Samuel was on his feet instantly, pulling on his boots and coat. "I will get Mrs. Patterson." The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. Adelaide had thought she understood pain, but this was something beyond anything she had experienced. Mrs. Patterson was a steady presence through it all, coaching Adelaide through each contraction, wiping her face with cool cloths, and telling her she was doing beautifully. Samuel held Adelaide's hand and looked like he might die himself from watching her suffer. "I am sorry," he kept saying. "I am so sorry." Adelaide would have laughed if she had the breath for it. "This is not your fault," she managed between contractions. "Well, it is partly your fault, but I was very much a willing participant." As evening fell on the second day of labor, Adelaide was exhausted beyond belief and starting to wonder if this baby would ever be born. But then Mrs. Patterson's face lit up. "I can see the head," she announced. "Adelaide, on the next contraction, I need you to push with everything you have got." Adelaide gathered the last of her strength and pushed, bearing down with all her might. The pain was enormous, all-consuming, and for a moment she thought she might actually break apart. Then suddenly there was release, and the sound of a baby crying filled the room. "It is a girl, Mrs. Patterson said, holding up a red-faced, squalling infant. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Adelaide collapsed back against the pillows, tears streaming down her face. Samuel was crying too, staring at his daughter with an expression of absolute awe. Mrs. Patterson cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped her in a soft blanket before placing her in Adelaide's arms. The baby was tiny and perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that were still the unfocused blue of all newborns. She had stopped crying the moment she was placed against Adelaide's chest, settling into her mother's arms like she had always belonged there. "Hello, little one," Adelaide whispered. "Welcome to the world." Samuel touched the baby's tiny hand with one finger, and she immediately grabbed hold of it with a surprisingly strong grip. "She is perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are both perfect." They named her Margaret Rose after Samuel's first wife and Adelaide's mother. It felt right to honor the women who had come before, whose lives had shaped the path that led Samuel and Adelaide to each other. Little Margaret, or Maggie as they quickly began calling her, was a good baby. She nursed well and slept in reasonable stretches, and Adelaide recovered from the birth faster than expected. Within 2 weeks, Mrs. Patterson declared them fit to travel, and they made their way back to the cabin in the mountains. Returning home with a baby felt like stepping into a new life. The cabin glowed with candlelight every evening, but now there was also the sound of Maggie's gurgles and cries, the smell of milk and baby soap, the constant presence of new life. Samuel was an attentive father, walking Maggie around the cabin when she was fussy, making faces to get her to smile, changing her diapers with the same careful competence he brought to everything else. "You are a natural," Adelaide told him one night as she watched him rock their daughter to sleep. "I am just trying to do better than I did the first time," Samuel said quietly. "Margaret and we lost 2 babies before they were born." She blamed herself, though it was no one's fault. We had finally given up on having children when the fever took her. He looked down at Maggie's sleeping face. "This feels like a gift I do not deserve but am grateful for anyway." Adelaide's heart ached for all the loss he had carried. "You deserve every bit of happiness, Samuel, and you are going to be an amazing father. You already are." The months that followed were exhausting but joyful. Maggie grew rapidly, changing from a tiny newborn into a chubby baby with Samuel's blue eyes and Adelaide's dark hair. She smiled early and often, especially when Samuel sang to her in his deep, rumbling voice. Adelaide had never heard him sing before Maggie was born, but apparently it was something he used to do for Margaret. "She likes songs," he explained when Adelaide commented on it. "Said my voice sounded like thunder rolling across the mountains." "I have not sung in years, but Maggie seems to like it." As spring returned to the mountains, Adelaide and Samuel celebrated their first wedding anniversary and Maggie's approaching half-birthday. They had expanded the cabin as planned, adding a separate room where Adelaide could make candles and where Maggie could play safely. Samuel's trapping had been good through the winter, and they had money saved up. "I have been thinking," Adelaide said one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset. Maggie was asleep in her cradle beside them, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. "What if we did open that chandlery in Gila City? Not to move there permanently, but maybe we could rent a small shop. I could go to town once or twice a month to sell candles and take orders, and we could build up a real business." Samuel considered this, his arm around Adelaide's shoulders. It would mean more time away from home, but it would also mean more security for Maggie's future. "And I have been teaching some of the women in town to make candles too. Maybe I could hire them to help with production." Adelaide looked up at him. "I do not want to give up this life we have built here, but I also think we could do more, be more. What do you think?" Samuel smiled, and Adelaide still felt her heart skip at the sight of it. He smiled so much more now than he had when they first met, and each smile felt like a small victory over the darkness he had lived in for so long. "I think you are brilliant and ambitious, and I would be a fool to try to hold you back. Let's do it." So they made plans and saved money, and by the time Maggie turned 1, Adelaide had opened a small chandlery on the main street of Gila City. She called it Golden Glow Candles, and it quickly became popular with both the townspeople and the miners who wanted to brighten their rough cabins and tents. Adelaide hired 3 women to help with production, teaching them the techniques her mother had taught her years ago. The business grew steadily. Adelaide spent a few days each month in town managing the shop while Samuel stayed home with Maggie, teaching their daughter to recognize animal tracks and edible plants even though she was still mostly crawling. When Adelaide returned from these trips, Maggie would squeal with delight and Samuel would look at her like she had been gone for months instead of days. "I missed you," he would say, kissing her thoroughly while Maggie gurgled happily in her cradle. "I missed you too," Adelaide would reply. But it is good to have something of my own again, something beyond just surviving. I know, Samuel said, and I am proud of you. You have built something real, Adelaide, something that is going to last. By their second anniversary, the chandlery was turning a steady profit, and Adelaide had hired a manager to handle day-to-day operations, so she would not have to travel as often. Maggie was walking and talking in simple sentences, calling Samuel Papa and Adelaide Mama, and demanding stories every night before bed. And every evening, without fail, they lit the candles that Adelaide had made. The cabin glowed golden as the sun set, a beacon of warmth and light in the wilderness. Sometimes Adelaide would stand in the doorway and look at that golden glow, marveling at how far she had come from the desperate woman whose wagon had broken down in the forest. One evening in their third year of marriage, as Adelaide stood watching the sunset with Maggie on her hip and Samuel beside her, she felt overwhelmingly grateful for the series of accidents and choices that had led her here. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had gone in a different direction that day?" she asked Samuel. "If I had walked away from your smoke instead of toward it?" Samuel pulled her close, his arm around both her and Maggie. "I try not to think about that. It is too terrifying to imagine a world where we never found each other." "I think we would have found each other somehow," Adelaide said. "Some connections are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." Maggie, who was now 2 and had strong opinions about everything, pointed at the cabin. "Pretty lights, Mama." "Yes, baby," Adelaide said, kissing her daughter's dark hair. "Pretty lights." As they walked back into the cabin together, Adelaide looked around at the life they had built, the wooden furniture Samuel had made with his own hands, the candles she had poured herself, lined up on every surface and filling the space with warm light, the toys scattered on the floor that Maggie played with while her parents worked, the big bed they shared every night, falling asleep wrapped around each other. This was what home felt like. Not a place on a map or a destination she had been traveling toward. Home was this man who had been broken and had healed, this child who was the living proof of second chances, this simple cabin that glowed golden with the light of candles made from tallow. Samuel came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. "What are you thinking about?" "How happy I am," Adelaide said simply. "How perfect this life is, even with all its challenges and difficulties. I would not change a single thing." "Not even the part where your wagon broke down and you nearly died in the wilderness," Adelaide laughed. "Especially not that part. That is when my real life began." They stood there together as darkness fell outside and the candles burned bright inside. A family built from loss and loneliness, and the determination to find light in the darkness. And the cabin glowed golden, just as it would every evening for all the years to come, a testament to love and survival, and the simple act of making something beautiful in a hard world. Over the years that followed, their family grew. Adelaide gave birth to 2 more children, a son they named Thomas after her father, and another daughter they called Rose. The cabin was expanded again and again, until it was more of a house than a simple mountain dwelling, with separate bedrooms for the children and a large workshop where Adelaide continued to make candles and teach her craft to anyone who wanted to learn. Samuel's trapping remained successful, and he became known throughout the region as one of the best trackers and hunters in the mountains. But he always made time for his family, teaching all 3 children the skills they would need to survive in the wilderness while also encouraging them to dream of bigger things. Maggie, the eldest, inherited her mother's business sense and her father's love of the mountains. By the time she was 16, she was managing the Golden Glow Candles shop in Gila City, and had expanded it to include other goods made by local craftspeople. Thomas became a guide, leading hunting parties and travelers through the mountain passes, while little Rose showed a talent for drawing and painting, creating beautiful images of the wilderness that surrounded them. Adelaide and Samuel grew older together, their love deepening with each passing year. Samuel's hair turned gray and his face became more weathered, but Adelaide still saw the strong, protective man who had taken her in when she had nowhere else to go. Adelaide's hands became rough from years of candle making, and her face lined from smiling, but Samuel still looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. On their 10th anniversary, Samuel carved a wooden plaque for Adelaide that read, "She made candles from tallow, and the mountain man's cabin glowed golden for the first time in a decade." He hung it above the fireplace, and Adelaide cried when she saw it. "This is our story," he said, holding her close. "The story of how light came back into my life when I had given up on ever seeing it again." "It is our story," Adelaide agreed, "but it is also the story of how I found home. How two broken people put each other back together and built something that will last." And it did last. Through hard winters and dry summers, through economic troubles and family illnesses, through all the ordinary trials and extraordinary joys that make up a life. The cabin continued to glow golden every evening, filled with candlelight and laughter and the warm presence of family. When Adelaide and Samuel were old and gray, sitting on the porch and watching their grandchildren play in the clearing, Adelaide would sometimes think back to that desperate girl who had walked through the forest toward a stranger's smoke. She barely recognized that version of herself anymore, that frightened widow who had thought survival was the same as living. "What are you smiling about?" Samuel would ask, his hand finding hers without him even looking. "Just remembering," Adelaide would say, "and being grateful." For what? For everything. For wagon wheels that break at exactly the right time. For men who live alone but have enough humanity left to help a stranger. For candles that glow golden and light the way home. Samuel would squeeze her hand, understanding without needing more words. Because that was what a lifetime together gave you. The ability to communicate in silences and gestures, in the comfortable shorthand of shared history. The chandlery business continued to thrive, eventually growing into a regional operation with shops in 3 different towns. But Adelaide never forgot where it all started, in a dark cabin with a grieving man who had forgotten how to see beauty in the world. She made it her mission to ensure that light was available to everyone who needed it, selling candles cheaply to those who could not afford much, and sometimes giving them away to families who had nothing. Light should not be a luxury, she would tell her employees. It should be a basic right, available to everyone regardless of their circumstances. Samuel supported her in this completely, understanding better than most how darkness could swallow a person whole if they let it. He made donations to the chandlery from his trapping profits, ensuring Adelaide could continue her charitable work without bankrupting the business. Together, they became pillars of their community, known for their generosity and their genuine care for others. But they never forgot that their truest home was the cabin in the mountains, the place where they had found each other and built a family from nothing but hope and determination. As Samuel grew frailer with age, he spent more time at the cabin and less time on the trap lines. Adelaide cut back her hours at the chandlery to be with him, and they spent long afternoons sitting together and reminiscing about their life. "You have any regrets?" Adelaide asked him one day when he was 75 and she was 57. Samuel thought about it seriously before answering. "I regret the years I spent in darkness after Margaret died. I wish I had found the strength to live again sooner, but I do not regret waiting for you because you were worth the wait." Adelaide felt tears prick at her eyes. After all these years, he could still make her cry with the simple honesty of his love. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Every hard thing I went through led me here to you and this life. I would do it all again in a heartbeat." Samuel pulled her close, and they sat together watching the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The candles were already lit inside the cabin, visible through the windows, glowing softly in the gathering dusk. "The cabin is glowing," Samuel said, a smile in his voice. "It always does," Adelaide replied. "Ever since the day I made those first candles from tallow. It has been glowing golden ever since, and it always will, for as long as someone is here to light them." Samuel lived to be 78, passing peacefully in his sleep with Adelaide beside him. His last words were, "Keep the lights burning, my love." Adelaide promised she would, and she kept that promise. Even after Samuel was gone, Adelaide continued to make candles every week, filling the cabin with golden light. Their children and grandchildren visited often, and Adelaide taught all of them the craft of candle making, passing down the knowledge her mother had given her so many years ago. Adelaide lived to be 93, a remarkable age for someone who had survived such a hard life. On her last evening, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, she asked them to light every candle in the cabin, just like she and Samuel used to do. "This is how your grandfather and I lived," she told them as the golden light filled every corner of the room. "Always choosing light over darkness, always making something beautiful even when the world was hard. I want you to promise me you will do the same." They all promised, and Adelaide closed her eyes with a smile on her face, ready to join Samuel wherever he had gone. The cabin remained in the family for generations, always glowing golden in the evenings as someone lit the candles and remembered the story of Adelaide and Samuel. The wooden plaque Samuel had carved stayed above the fireplace, a reminder of how two lost souls had found each other in the wilderness and built a life that was a testament to the power of love and light. And in Gila City, the Golden Glow Candles shop continued to operate, now run by Adelaide and Samuel's great-great-grandchildren, still providing light to anyone who needed it. The business had grown far beyond what Adelaide could have imagined, but it never lost sight of its founding principle. That light should be available to everyone, and that the simple act of making something beautiful could transform lives. The story of the woman who made candles from tallow and lit up the mountain man's cabin became a local legend, passed down through families and told around campfires. But for those who had known Adelaide and Samuel personally, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder that it is never too late to find love, that light can return even to the darkest places, and that second chances are always possible for those brave enough to reach for them. In the end, Adelaide and Samuel's legacy was not just the business they had built or the children they had raised. It was the simple, profound truth they had lived by, that making light in the darkness was one of the most important things a person could do. Whether that light came from candles made of tallow or from the love shared between two people who had been given a second chance, it had the power to transform everything it touched. And so the cabin continued to glow golden, generation after generation, a beacon in the wilderness and a testament to the enduring power of love, hope, and the simple act of choosing light over darkness. The story that had begun with a broken wagon wheel and a desperate walk through the forest had become something timeless, a legacy that would continue as long as someone remembered to light the candles and tell the tale of she made candles from tallow, and the mountain man's cabin glowed golden for the first time in a decade.